From the IATEFL Membership Committee, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor David Crystal as our first speaker in our new IATEFL webinar series. Professor Crystal is a distinguished linguist and the author of over 100 books, including the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Language and the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language. Recent books include The Story of English in 100 Words and Spell It Out, the singular story of English spelling. A new book with Hilary Crystal, Wordsmiths and Warriors, the English Language Tourist Guide to Britain, is due out in September. If you would like more information about David Crystal and his work, it can be found on his website, www.davidcrystal.com. And with no further ado, I am delighted to turn this over to Professor David Crystal. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Marjorie. And I see a whole pile of yeses coming down the screen there, so everybody seems to have seen you. I hope they can see me. This is really weird, though. I mean, I've been to IATEFLs for over 20 years. I usually see the people I'm talking to, so they can throw things and the like. This is very weird not seeing you all out there, but I can imagine you. So anyway, thanks for those of you who have sent in questions so far. There'll be a chance to do some more at the end of the formal bit of the talk. I'm going to talk for about, I don't know, depends how long it takes to answer these questions, about 40 minutes, 45 minutes maybe, and that'll leave us a bit of time. I should begin by saying that I'm going to try and answer all the questions that were sent in before that deadline that I'm able to answer. That's a very important point. You see, some of you sent in questions about teaching practice, methodology, and so on, use of first language in the classroom, order of teaching, listening, speaking, reading, writing, use of games, and all of that. Well, I can't answer those. I'm not a teacher in that sense. I'm just a linguist. I've got the easy job here. Somebody suggested that I should be education minister a few seconds ago. Well, if I were, and if I was in charge of the world, I would change things dramatically, because it's you guys, it's you teachers that have got the difficult job. I mean, there's no more difficult job in the world than teaching a language, unless it's interpreting and translating one. When you think of all the complexity that goes on, all the sounds, all the grammar, all the vocabulary, and all the rest of it, and you've got to teach this thing, I've just got to study it. I've got the easy job. If I were education minister for the world, I would double teachers' pay immediately. I think that would be my first job. But anyway, I'm not likely to be. So the other thing I can't do is talk about individual situations. I can't talk about case studies. I mean, to do a case study, you have to really know a place. So those of you who have said to me, in my situation, I have the following problem. Well, I can't help there really. So what I've done is I've chosen the general questions, the ones where I have something to say or could say something. The answers are going to have to be brief, I'm afraid, because, well, each question, you ask big questions, and each one could be a lecture in itself. So what I'm going to do is give fairly brief answers to these questions, and then if there's a need to follow up in some way, then I will answer them on my blog, or I'll answer them via the website, which usually produces an answer on my blog. So there's always the possibility for following up after this hour. Now, I don't know whether the picture is okay. Because there is this unaccustomed sun on Anglesey, it's sort of blasting through my window here into the house. We've just closed the blind, and if that gets too dark, we can always open it up again. Oh, what have you done? Hey, light from above. This is false light. This is not sunlight. This is ceiling light. Let's see how that goes anyway. So, general questions. Shall we move on to the first one? Who's controlling the slides here? You guys somewhere in the ether. Let me find my way in. Right, there we are. So, how many active, this is from Michael in Austria, how many active languages are there today in the world, and why did so many different languages develop? Why are they also written in different directions? Who determined this aspect of the written language? Well, why in different directions? My answer to that is very simple. Why not? Language diversity makes use of all options, both in speaking and in writing. So when you're writing a language down for the first time, you can go anywhere you like, really, and people did. depending on various factors like the kind of tool you were using and the material you were using it with, even possibly the handedness of the person who first wrote it down might dictate the way in which a piece of writing might go. So in olden times, you got writing going in one direction and then in the other and then down and even up and then in both ways, this boustrophodon, like the ox pulls the plough, with one line going in one direction and going back in the other direction and so on. So all these possibilities. It doesn't take long. Why so many different languages develop? It doesn't take long for languages to grow, you see. I mean, we're used to thinking these days of languages growing very slowly, but think 1,000 years ago, there were no Romance languages. Well, just the infancy origins of some of them. And now we've got a whole family of Romance languages, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and so on, in 1,000 years. So, multiply that by the 150,000 years or so that there may have been when humans had some sort of capability to talk to each other. And you can see that we've lost more languages than we've got. Anyway, thousands more languages have disappeared than the ones that we've got at the moment. Let me just look. Those languages being born these days, somebody's sending me. Well, the number of languages that are dying, I was just going to go on to that actually, the number of languages that are dying far outnumber the number of languages that are being born. So how many active languages are there today in the world? Go on to Ethnologue and you'll find that the figure is somewhere between 6,500 and 7,000. My feeling is it's probably somewhere near 6,000. But yes, endangered languages is the thing. There's a language dying out somewhere in the world every 2 weeks on average, people think. Half the languages in the world are so seriously endangered that they're not going to outlive the present century. And so that figure's coming down and down and down. That's why I say it's probably nearer 6,000 now than the ones that were being surveyed a few years ago, where the figure was nearer 7,000. New languages being born? Well, we'll come on to that in just a second, because if we move on to the second slide, which is from Marjorie in Austria. What are the distinctions between an official language and a dialect? Can dialects grow into languages? If so, what determines this change? Well, that's the point. This is one of the reasons why the figures about language are so uncertain, because of this distinction between dialect and language. If you live in a country where there's a standard language and everybody knows what the dialects are, like the UK, it's not a difficult problem, that one. It's not a difficult question to answer. But go to various parts of the world where the languages haven't been studied very much, and you sometimes just don't know whether the way two people speak are the same language or different languages. There's so much interaction between them, so much contact and so on. The usual criterion is that if two varieties are mutually intelligible, then they're the same language. But you see, then political considerations complicate the matter. So, can new languages be born? Well, yes, if the political will is there. And the best example of this is Yugoslavia from 1990, where everybody spoke Serbo-Croatian in various dialects of one kind and another. They had a Croatian version in Croatia and a Serbian version in Serbia and so on. And then there was the Civil War, and then everybody became independent. So now you no longer speak a dialect of Serbo-Croatian in Croatia, you speak Croatian. And they speak Serbian, and they speak Montenegrin, and they speak Bosnian, and so on. And so suddenly, where there was one language, there are now 4 or 5 or more. And this is a very typical situation around the world. But the number of new languages that come into being in this way is very small compared with the ones that are dying out. Oh, and one other point, of course, we mustn't forget that as English becomes a global language, one of the likely consequences is going to be an English family of languages. In other words, just like Romance developed into the various Romance languages 1,000 years ago, so English is already showing signs of some new varieties becoming so different that they are likely to be considered as different languages in due course. I mean, take the pidgin languages like Tok Pigeon in Papua New Guinea, or maybe Singlish in Singapore, which are already so different from what we normally understand as English that I think you may have to say that they are new languages in being, or in the very infancy anyway. And the more they develop a written form, the more these languages will be seen to be as such. Cherry asks, who surveys how many languages are there? Is there a World Language Authority? No, there aren't. There isn't. No, there aren't. No, there isn't. What there is UNESCO, which has got a red book of endangered languages, and there are people there who do try to monitor the language situation in the world. But on the whole, this is left to private individuals, organizations like Ethnologue, some of the big language surveys that were done in the 1990s that were published in the Encyclopedia of Linguistics, for example. It's left to individuals to do this, and that's one of the problems, because even Ethnologue, you see, has an awful lot of material that is out of date. Some of the estimates for language numbers in there go back decades. And how do you keep on top of all the languages in the world? It ought to be done in a general kind of way by an organization like UNESCO, but it hasn't been yet. A language is a dialect with an army, says Tim, and a navy and an air force, and these days probably and an internet. But yes, you're making the political point once again. Anybody can call themselves a language if they've got the political clout to do so. That's one of the reasons, for example, why Scots English up in Scotland, which a number of Scottish people would like to call Scots as a separate language, will not be called a separate language until such time as Scotland develops a kind of independence and power, which means that it can call its language what it likes. Until that kind of, language always depends on power underneath it to have status. And this is one of the problems. So, we'll come on to that one later. What's happening, you see, is that people are sending in questions through the system, and I'm concentrating on the questions that have come in so far. And one or two of these things we'll pick up as the afternoon proceeds. But I want to cover the questions that have come in already, because these are the people who sent questions in a week or so ago. And the third slide is one. This is about multilingualism from Cornelia in Germany. Is it good, she says, if children grow up with more than one language? If they do, will they ever learn one language properly? Well, I think to answer this one, you have to start with the world situation. Remember that something like 3/4 of the people in the world are bilingual to a greater or lesser extent. Monolingualism is the exception. It's monolingual people who are the handicapped ones. Bilingualism is the human norm. And perhaps I should say multilingualism, because in something like half the environments of the world, people don't just have 2 languages. 2 is for boring, More than 2. Have as many as you like. 4, 5, 6 languages, very normal in many parts of Africa, for instance. Now, if they do, will they ever learn one language properly? Well, what does properly mean? If properly means know everything about the language that there is to know, then nobody speaks a language properly. Take English. There's over 1 million words in English. Well over. Nobody knows how many exactly. How many do I know? I don't know. I probably know about somewhere between 80 and 100,000 of them. So there's 900,000 words I don't know in English. So do I speak English properly? You see the point. There's always new stuff to be learned in a language. One learns as much of a language as one needs. And that means that in one language you may only need a certain amount, and in another language you need a bit more. And the amount you know will vary depending upon the circumstance in which you find yourself. There's a great myth that multilinguals are equally fluent in their languages. Well, they're not. Multilinguals vary enormously. I don't think I've ever met a bilingual person who would claim to be equally fluent in the 2 languages they know. There's always something that makes one language stronger than the other in a particular situation. As for the benefits, is it good if children grow up with more than one language? Well, absolutely. The benefits are enormous. 20 years ago, it was very difficult to know what these were, but there's been a huge amount of research done into bilingualism over the last couple of decades. To sum it up briefly is difficult in a short time, but plainly there are cognitive advantages. Languages make people think in different ways. So multilingualism is likely to promote greater flexibility of thought, creativity, problem-solving abilities, both verbal and non-verbal IQ. It's also suggested that the greater brain activity involved may, as with all forms of mental exercise, reduce the onset of mental disorders in later life. I love that piece of research. And then there's cognitive skills, C for that. H for human understanding. The world, as we see with endangered languages, is a mosaic of visions, each expressed through an individual language. The totality of human wisdom is not found in any one language. So the more languages we know, the more we understand what it is to be human. And then there's the sense of achievement that comes. Learning another language, even to a limited level, removes the frustration of being unable to communicate in its setting, generates a strong sense of fulfillment. And as with any acquired skill, people are justly proud of what they've achieved. And then there's the political benefits. I mean, mutual understanding, alliances, alignments, all sorts of political cooperation, enhanced when the parties know each other's languages, don't they? Interpreters and translators foster intelligible communication, but they can't replace the sense of mutual respect which comes from first-hand linguistic ability, it seems to me. And then there's the economic benefits of bilingualism. Multilingualism is a desirable skill in the highly competitive marketplace of the modern world. At an individual level, it provides a wider range of opportunities for job seekers. And at a corporate level, it promotes interest in the company's products and services if they're expressed in the language of the customer. And then there are linguistic benefits. I mean, the more languages we know, even in a limited way, the more we come to understand how language works. We stop being scared of languages. We find new languages easier to learn, I think. We also, incidentally, become more aware of the characteristic features of our mother tongue. I mean, English-speaking people often say they've learned about English grammar as a result of having to learn a foreign language. You know, you get that kind of trade-off. And then finally, well, there's more than finally, but the one that comes to mind now is social skills. Learning another language is to learn another culture and another way of behaving. So as a result, multilingual people develop a wider range of social skills, I think, becoming more outward-looking, likely to have a greater respect for cultural difference and so on. Anyway, that's a list of some of the benefits. Well, I suppose some of you could add to those. And on another slide now, Claire from Germany. Is it possible for adults who started learning a foreign language as an adult to become bilingual in both that language and their first language? Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. I mean, adults can learn other languages to any required fluency level, depending on such factors as motivation and opportunity. I mean, this is nothing to do with the old story about, you know, kids having that special ability, that natural ability to learn languages. Obviously, they do. But adults have got other things as well. They've got learning skills, they've got experience, they've got all kinds of factors at their disposal, plus an awful lot of potential motivation. So if I was to wave over your head $1 million and say, learn this language, you're going to learn this language, you know. Only needs a bit of a kick and you get there. To any required fluency level. Remember, one's not talking about learning a language to be able to read Shakespeare straight away or anything like that. One learns a language to the degree that one needs to use it to solve the communication issues that you're faced with. So, moving on to global English now, the next slide. These questions came in more or less in this order a few days ago. Oh, I love this one. Nicholas from Uruguay, what do you say to people who think that you have a triumphalist view on the global spread of English? Well, this is a polite seminar, so the answer I'd like to give, I can't really say. Otherwise, suddenly all your filters would block the swear words. Yeah, there were a few people, especially a decade ago, who read my book on English as a global language, saw me making statements like, English is a global language, and said, there we are, triumphalism, you know. Well, you know, this is one of the biggest misconceptions in linguistics as a whole. A lot of linguists get this kind of criticism. As soon as they start describing a language, people sort of say they're lauding it, celebrating it. Well, in a sense, we are. You know, I celebrate all languages. That's what being a linguist is. I'm here in Wales at the moment. I mean, I'm delighted to see the success of Welsh as a minority language in Wales, growing and growing and growing. If I say to you that Welsh is a success story, you would then condemn me for being triumphalist about Welsh. Well, I would say the same thing about any language. Every language is beautiful. Every language is wonderful. And anybody who's read my work on language death and language endangerment couldn't for one moment think that I was being triumphalist about any of these languages, least of all English. I'm afraid just stating the facts about the success of a language does lead some naive people to think that one is being triumphalist. All I say to them in reply is, read what I've written. Or, as that politician in America said a few years ago, read my lips. Anyway, on to something more positive. Do you think, Nicholas, again, do you still think that globally English will both split and converge, with local variants becoming less mutually comprehensible, generating a need for a world standard spoken English? Or is technology reducing those local variants? You know, there are several questions I get asked, and the answer has to be, it's too soon to say. It really is. The technology point, you see, we've only had this internet technology for 20 years. For most people, it's a little over a decade. This is far too soon to say what's going on in its influence on languages. All the evidence is that the internet is increasing diversity. I mean, it wasn't at the beginning. The internet at the beginning was English. But, you know, it became rapidly multilingual. 2003 was that critical year where over half the hosts in the world were in languages other than English. And the evidence is that multilingual presence on the internet is increasing all the time. And so we've got a multilingual web, we've got accessibility to languages and dialects that were never there before. The internet has been a boon for endangered languages, because think about it, if you did have an endangered language and you wanted to get it in front of the world, you couldn't have done it before the internet came along. You know, the odds on getting a broadcast or a newspaper article were remote. Now, if you've got a terminal or even just a mobile phone, you can have your endangered language in front of everybody in no time at all. And so I think the global English question is not that local variants will become less mutually comprehensible. They might on the ground, but then the internet will also provide accessibility. If I don't understand South African English and I want to understand it, I now just go online and read and contact people in South Africa. South African English is up there in a way that it wasn't 10 years ago. So I think the internet is having this double effect at the moment, and it's actually too soon to say what the long-term effects are going to be. And this relates to the next question, which comes from you in Munich, Ian McMaster, chief editor of Spotlight, which refreshes the English language magazine parts that other magazines do not reach. Brilliant magazine. Well done, Ian, over the years with that. You say in the book, English as a global language, world standard spoken English is going to arise. Yes, I said that, and I still believe that. Then you say, what might have the most influence? Well, the US rather than UK, you know, is that the influence it's going to be? That's what I thought 10 years ago, and I still do think it. I mean, all the evidence suggests that nothing much has changed in the last 10 years, but again, it's too soon to say. There are already signs of a British fight back in some ways. I don't know whether any of you know, there's a lovely little blog in the States run by a guy called Ben Yagoda, Y-A-G-O-D-A. And what Ben is doing is he's collecting examples of British English influencing American English rather than the other way around. And he's found a fair number. You know, we're talking hundreds of examples now, not just the few examples that were here a few years ago. I mean, the pubs were some of the first things to emerge over there, you know, a pub in America, what? And now gastro pubs are over there. And whereas once upon a time Americans used to talk about expiration dates for the foodstuffs in stores, now they talk about sell-by dates, which is very much a British expression. Ben Yagoda says he's often encountered Americans talking about chatting people up, or saying that things are twee and trendy and so on. These are all British expressions that have gone the other way. And so, difficult to say really how many of these will come into that rather vague notion of a world standard, but I suspect that there's going to be a mix, more of a mix of these different varieties than there were, than I was thinking a few years ago. Also with varieties from around the, as it were, the non-native speaking parts of the world bringing in their contribution. After all, when you've got as many people speaking English in India in some shape or form as speak English in Britain and America and Australia and so on combined, then that's bound to have an effect on world standard spoken English eventually. So on a bit, from Elizabeth now in Austria. Do languages influence the way we think and perceive the world? That's a huge question. Elizabeth, some people take a whole course to try and answer this one. It's so complex. My answer is, well, to an extent, yes, they must. Not entirely, as Worf and the others suggested once upon a time. Otherwise, translation and interpreting would simply not be possible, successful translation. The question is, how much influence is there from an individual language? As I said before, languages are visions. The languages of the world are a mosaic of visions. Each vision is a unique view of the world. And so there is always going to be differences. The question is, how much difference is there? Clearly, the closer the languages are to each other, historically, the less there are going to be individual differences of this kind. The further apart they are, the more there are going to be differences. I remember doing an experiment a few years ago for an advertising company where we were translating keywords, advertising keywords into different languages. And one of the things we had to do was employ a large team of translators, basically putting dictionaries into a one-to-one relationship. And one of the questions I asked them was, how often do you encounter the answer, we haven't got a word for it in our language? Or, I'm not happy with the translation of this word in our language, And for something like English into French or English into Spanish, it was about 10%. In other words, about 90% of the time, the translators were quite happily translating one for one, no cultural differences whatsoever, and so on, they felt. But for 10%, it was much more complex. Individual differences were coming in. And then a language that was further away, like Chinese, the figure was down to about 50%, you see. So it all depends on which languages you're comparing with. And certainly, when you say about think and perceive, Elizabeth, well, don't forget there's a third dimension here that you haven't mentioned, and that is feeling. And do languages influence the way we feel about the world? I think this is the most important thing of all, actually. Different reactions we have to words and situations and literary texts and all the rest of it, very important, but they get us here rather than here. And there are so many notions in the languages of the world where I've seen this often, as I guess most of you have out there. People from different cultural backgrounds watching the same program or just listening to the same sentence sometimes, and they're affected in different ways. I've seen a situation where a particular word even has produced tears on the part of one person and blank incomprehension on the part of another. I mean, a word like some of the words that you have in your languages for, feelings of longing, feelings of yearning, nostalgia, feelings of identity. Words like, in Welsh we have a word hiraeth, which means the feeling of nostalgia that you have for your past and your present and all that to do with Welsh. And in Portuguese, there's saudade, isn't there? And many languages have got this kind of word. Well, to many of us, that's just a word. But to the person who feels it, it brings forth all sorts of emotions. So I think the short answer is yes, but a lot depends on how much. And then on to another one from Matt in Germany. Do you think there'll be such a thing as an international cultural reference dictionary one day? And he also has an associated question. Do you think international companies should invest in seminars, etc.? You can read it now. Well, the first one, international cultural reference. I so hope so. Oh, I do hope so. I mean, this is one of the things I do when I've got the time and it's been set up in that way and we're wandering around the world. I have a meeting with a group of teachers and students, and one of the things we do is a workshop in which we try and build up a dictionary of the local cultural expressions that relate to the use of English in their country. So everybody has them, words for local fauna and flora, for myths and legends, the words for your politicians, what are the nicknames of your political parties, what's the nickname of your prime minister, all this sort of thing, which you know and take for granted, and I don't know as somebody who doesn't know your culture. So everywhere you go, you encounter this kind of thing. Very hard to study, actually. Well, it doesn't take long to accumulate a dictionary. In an hour, I've produced little dictionaries of 100 words, 200 words, 300 words, just brainstorming from the people who are there. You have to do it with somebody from outside the culture there. If people just within the culture do it, it doesn't work so well. You've got to have somebody from outside who says, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? The Longman Dictionary of English Language and Culture tried to do this years and years ago, not very successfully. It was a great innovative work and it made some progress, but it was difficult capturing the cultural identity for the entire world, you know. You need to do it locally to begin with. One thing I am sure about is one does need this systematic cultural perspective in English language teaching. I mean, it's there sporadically, this English culture, as it were. And if I'm learning French, French culture in a French textbook and so on. But it's not done systematically. What I mean by that is that if you pick up an ELT book and chapter 3 in book 3 says shopping in Oxford Street, well, the reason for the chapter is to do with some point of grammar or some point of vocabulary or something. They use Oxford Street because it's a nice, easy way into that aspect of culture, to do with shopping, shall we say. But it's not being done systematically. To do it systematically, the culture of shopping in London, let alone in Britain, you'd have to look systematically at the alternatives to Oxford Street. If you don't go to Oxford Street, where else might you go? And what kind of alternative kinds of shopping would you encounter in other places? So that if I, in the end, said to you, my watch is more Portobello Road than Oxford Street, what does that mean? Well, that requires a level of cultural awareness that you know what the different shopping areas are in London, and you have to know that Portobello Road has a market, a street market, where the goods on sale are probably often very phony goods compared with the ones in Oxford Street, and so on. Now, you know, generalize that to the whole field of the culture of shopping in Britain, or in any language, and you see the kind of problem that is required to be solved if you're going to do a cultural dictionary in a systematic way. But it definitely needs to be done. And the second question Mark raised about seminars and raising awareness among native English speakers, oh, you most certainly, I do think that companies should invest in this way. Some are beginning to do so. I have had some experiences of sitting in on business meetings, especially in the last 10 years. What I say to them basically is do some linguistics, you know, develop a linguistic awareness of what the varieties of language are. In particular, develop a sense of the difference between formal and informal levels of communication. The biggest problem I find is that when everybody's sitting around a table, a lot of businessmen, for instance, or a lot of academics with a formal agenda, talking in a formal way about official issues, then on the whole, the cultural interference is limited. People don't use colloquial idioms and so on so much there. But as soon as the meeting breaks up and they go for coffee outside, or if there is a kind of lull in the meeting and people start talking amongst themselves, then suddenly the kind of cultural idiosyncrasy and idiomaticity comes to the fore. And that's when people feel excluded. You know, the native guys in the room start chatting together, make some flip remark, and everybody laughs. All the native speakers laugh, but the non-native speakers don't because they can't follow the idiom or whatever it is. And that's the point where I think there needs to be some sensitivity to the impact of what it is you're saying. So the more this kind of awareness can be brought into corporate situations, the better, it seems to me. So move on now to specific aspects of language. I must speed up a bit or I'm not going to get through all these questions. Nicholas from Uruguay says, you wrote a spelling dictionary. Why prescriptive spelling is okay, but not prescriptive grammar? Well, there's a misunderstanding here. Prescriptive means the teaching of unauthentic rules about a language. Rules that are not genuine, false rules, artificial rules, rules that are thought up by some individual who thinks that's the way people ought to speak or people ought to write. It's nothing to do with teaching. Of course, when you're teaching, you have to be prescriptive in a different sense. You know, you've got to tell people this is correct and this is incorrect. But I hope that what you're saying is that when what you're claiming is correct is genuinely used by the people of the language that you're teaching about. Now, the thing about prescriptivism is that, and that's why it's called prescriptivism in a bad sense, is that the rules that were being taught were not real rules. You know, you should never split an infinitive. You must never say I will or I shall, you know, one or the other, whatever. Never end a sentence with a preposition. All these false rules that were there. That's what prescriptivism is about, and it applies just as much to spelling as it does to grammar. So in spelling, there are lots of variations. Do you spell realize with an S or a Z? Do you spell judgment with an E or without an E? Do you put a comma in before the word and in the sentence, the tall, dark, and handsome man did something or other? You might or might not. Usage is split in these areas. A prescriptive approach would say, you must always use an S, or you must always spell judgment with an E, or you must always not have a comma, which is how Michael Gove at the moment is insisting that young people write in the current test that's going through primary schools at the moment. This is prescriptivism, and it's something that ought to be avoided. Now, Roy in the Netherlands, intonation is not always on the teaching agenda in the classroom, but we know it's cultural specific. Should intonation be given more attention now at teaching EFL with a growing global practice? Oh yes, most certainly it should be. And from the very beginning too. We're not talking here about adding it on in some way late on in the course. No, right from the very beginning. I mean, it can't be avoided. Everything that is said has to have an intonation. It has to have a rhythm. It has to have a tone of voice. You can't avoid it. So unless you are teaching language purely in its written form, then intonation is there from the outset, and therefore some reflection on its value and the implications of it and the alternatives that are there are needed. The only thing I would say is that don't restrict the issue to intonation. The question is prosody. Prosody in the broader sense, which means pitch, loudness, speed, rhythm, pause, tone of voice. And when you look at the way English is developing around the English-speaking world at the moment, what one sees is that rhythm is actually far more important than intonation when it comes to listening comprehension. Because the rhythm I'm using now, the tum-ti-tum-ti-tum, stress-timed rhythm, is very different from the rat-tat-tat-tat syllable-timed rhythm, which you get in so many parts of the world. And making sure that people are able to handle a comprehensible rhythm is as important, if not more important, than handling appropriate intonation. On to Roy from the Netherlands, asking about SVO as a basic word order for English. He's aware that speakers like Yoda in the big science films say things like, questions have I for you, full of the force I am, and things of that kind. Do I foresee significant shifts in current word order preference? Don't think so. No sign of it yet, really. Word order hasn't changed all that much in the last couple of 100 years. It did change dramatically in the early Middle Ages, which incidentally is when Yoda's sentence order, word order, was actually used in English. You actually get Yoda-type sentences in the early Middle Ages. Now, word order is the slowest to change. And not even on the internet do we see much signs of new word orders. That is, word orders that were not around before the internet started. So I don't see much change taking place there in the foreseeable future. And then on to 3 little questions about usage from Anya in Austria. I've put them all up at the same time. All I can do is give a quick comment on each. Usage questions can take a long time to explore, but can you ever use usually with a progressive tense? You actually did in your plenary in Liverpool, she says. If I did, I did. It's not actually in the written paper. I just had a look before. It's online now at my website and you can read it. And I don't use the word usually in it. So it must have been one of the off-the-cuff remarks. Now, if that's so, then what I'm doing is I'm just following a big trend in the language at the moment, which is the increase in the use of the progressive. That's one of the dominant things in English in the last 20 years. The progressive or continuous form is being used more than it ever was before. You see it in McDonald's, don't you? What's the McDonald's slogan? Not I love it, but I'm loving it. I'm loving it. 20 years ago, the slogan would have been I love it. And so this progressive development is taking place. And as a result, it's pulling the adverbs behind it. And so I think you're going to increasingly see adverbs which used to be used only with the simple present, the non-progressive, whatever you'd like to call it, increasingly being used with the progressive. And I'm not surprised if I used it in that way. Is it correct to say she never would have done that instead of she would never have done that? Sure it is. Of course it is. The further forward you bring the adverb, the more emphatic the sentence becomes. I never would have guessed, as it were, that you would have asked such a question. I never would have guessed. That's more normal even than I would never have guessed, at least it is for me. And in fact, there was a gospel song a few years ago, wasn't there, by Martin Sapp. Do you remember it? Called Never Would Have Made It. I don't know how high it went in the charts, but it's a perfectly normal construction these days. And then she recently read the following sentence in a book. She would have talked to him if he came, might not if he had come. Ooh, yes, that is odd, isn't it? Need more context here to understand it. I don't like having sentences in isolation outside of context, because often the context makes the difference. It is odd to see it in a book, though, where you would have expected the had form to be used. On the other hand, if this is a report of somebody speaking, then I'm not surprised to see it at all, because this is another example of a blend, a syntactic blend. And all I can say here is that the paper I gave at IATEFL in Liverpool a few weeks ago was all about syntactic blends. And if you're interested in this as a topic, go there, read it, and you'll get more about this kind of thing. And then Phil from the UK, school kids around the world spend a lot of time learning the rules of reported speech. Any real value in this? Well, it's a teaching question, really. I can't comment on the amount of time it takes. I've no experience of that at all, Phil, I'm afraid. All I can say is that reported speech in its various forms, direct, indirect, and so on, is so common in newspaper reporting and news broadcasts and narratives of all kinds and gossip and all of that, that it's a distinctive feature of everyday English, and to omit it in some way or to play it down would be to produce a bit of a barrier between the user and those kinds of styles. So I would have thought there was some value in it, but I think to explore that one would take a lot longer than the time we've got at the moment. And then something about texting, where I described the text messaging phenomenon. Does the proliferation of QWERTY keypads and touchscreens mark the beginning of the end for text speak? Text speak? Well, it depends what you mean, really. If you mean, does it mean the end of the sending of written messages through your mobile phone? Well, there's no reduction here at the moment, even after a few years of these new keypads. I mean, it's still increasing in number as you go around the world, because it is simply an alternative communicative option. If you mean, is the use of texting abbreviations falling in text messaging, meaning text speak in that sense, then yes, definitely, that is happening. It's happening in places that have had text messaging in this way for about a decade. See, there's a novelty value about abbreviations, especially among young people. They love them. And so you find 10-year-olds in this country still glorying in using things like see you later and all this sort of thing. But I was in a school a few weeks ago with sixth formers, that is 17-year-olds and so on, and I said to them, we collected a corpus of their text messages for analysis, and we looked at them and I said, where are all your abbreviations? And they looked at me and said, we don't do that anymore. You know, we used to do that when we were younger, they said. They're naff, they said. They're not fashionable, they're not cool now. Down the school they were cool, but not in the sixth form. And I remember one young lad came up to me and he said, I stopped abbreviating in that way when my parents started to. Which illustrates the point perfectly, that these things are fashion bound. And I would suspect that there will be a reduction in texting in that way. But again, it's too soon to say. And the biggest changes haven't happened yet, namely speech to text. That's the big thing that's going to happen, which will alter everything. And then the last one that came in advance has the shortest answer of all, really. Mike from the UK says, what is your favourite quote about language? I can answer that so easily. I don't have one. And the reason is, it's a bit like going up to a doctor and saying, what's your favourite disease? You know, to me, it's a meaningless question. I don't have favourites. Linguists don't have favourites on the whole. I certainly don't. I mean, I'll put it the other way around. Everything is my favourite. Hilary and I, a few years ago, edited a book called Words on Words, Quotations about Language and Languages. You can find it again now. It's been out of print for a few years, but we've just made it available as an ebook on our new website. And if you go there, you'll find several thousand quotations about language and languages, and I love them all. And I open them at any one page, and I would say, yeah, that's my favorite. And then I look over there and I say, that's my favorite. So you see, I don't have a favorite really. Shame, but there we are. Well, that's the formal part of the questioning over, guys. We've got a quarter of an hour left for individual questions to come in, especially those that have come from arising out of the situation that we've been talking about hitherto. And Hilary has rushed into the other room and kindly printed out the first few of them. And a couple have come through via the system here anyway. Let me begin with those. Because there are a couple of questions here from a gang out in Libya, I believe. Hi, everybody. From Osama, who asks me, if I want to learn a language, is it necessary to study the tradition, culture, and literature of that language? Well, that follows up very nicely, doesn't it? The point I made earlier on about culture, the answer is yes, indeed. And not just at an advanced level either. You know, learning about culture and literature sounds rather advanced, doesn't it? You know, we will do it later. We'll get the basic grammar first, and the basic pronunciation and so on, basic vocabulary, and then we'll do the culture. That is not the way to do it, in my view. As a linguist, I speak now. Because culture is there from the very beginning. As soon as you say anything, you have to ask the question, I don't know anything yet, so how do I even hesitate in the language? Is hesitation something vocal, or is it something I do with my hands? What is it polite to talk about in the language, or to not talk about? How am I going to greet people in the language? Quite basic things. Should I say please when asking for something in the language? All of these are very elementary points of culture that need to be there from the very beginning. And then the other reason I think why it's so important is that when you, from a comprehension level, when you start listening and especially reading, and you go online or you start reading a newspaper, you are always going to encounter cultural influence. For instance, the use of Shakespeare in newspapers. How many headlines are there in newspapers in English which start off, to fight or not to fight, or to pay or not to pay? And that's the clever editor, you know, putting in a clever headline. But why is it clever? Well, if you don't know Hamlet, then you won't get the point. You won't get the joke. It's all based, of course, on Hamlet's to be or not to be. That is the question. If you don't know the cultural reference, the literary reference, you'll miss the point completely. And because this is so frequent in television advertisements and all sorts of commercial situations, well, that's the reason why I think you need to have that kind of cultural perspective from the outset. And then Vinaya, also from Libya, says she has one of her students from Najla, is it? Can the newly acquired freedom of expression in the Arab Spring countries affect the learning of the English language? Well, this is a bigger question than I can answer, but my instinct is to say it must do, really, but not in a linguistic sense. I mean, there might be linguistic considerations. The very phrase Arab Spring, after all, is a novelty in the English language, going, of course, back to earlier springs like the Prague Spring and so on. Has liberalisation made it easier to access varieties that were not available before? Probably has. It's more for you to say than for me. Use of social media is obviously affecting language in various ways, so that must mean that might make a different, introduce a different perspective into your learning situation. But I think probably the bigger answer is one that goes beyond what a mere linguist can say, and that's perhaps the economic and political answer. I mean, after all, this kind of opening up of a country to new influences does mean also that there are going to be new political relations established, and that must mean eventually new investment and new commercial opportunities, which could then lead to better facilities in training, better resources, better opportunities. For example, the British Council bringing in new programs, new access to qualifications, bringing in arts events that were not available before. And the arts, as you were saying, Osama, is another important aspect of the culture side of things. So I think probably there will be an impact, but I don't quite know how long it'll take before that will happen. Now, wow, there have been 24 questions, 28, they're coming in all over the place. Look, I haven't even had time to read them yet, and we've only got a few minutes. So what I'm going to do, guys, is this. I'm going to look at some of these and pull the odd ones out that I can see straight away. But the ones that I don't have a chance to answer now, I'll try and say something about them on my blog. It'll take me a day or so to get through them, but if you go to my blog, say from Monday, I'll try and cover all the ones that we're dealing with. Wow, these are big questions. I'll just take them in the order they came in. Gosia, how can we classify ELF then? English as a lingua franca. Too soon to classify it. I mean, we don't yet know what English as a lingua franca is. It's a very popular movement at the moment. It's made one important contribution, which is this, and that is that we no longer see native speaker English as the only privileged variety in the English-speaking world. How could that possibly be? Of the 2 billion people there are that speak English around the world, only 400 million of them are native speakers. So for every one native speaker, there are 4 or 5 non-native speakers. The centre of gravity has shifted over there. And it is no longer possible to dismiss these new varieties of English as being in some sense non-standard or inferior or gutter speak and all the rest of it. Especially when the people who speak these different varieties have just as much power economically, politically, culturally as native speakers do. Native speakers are slowly realizing the political realities, the economic realities here. If a big businessman from another part of the world comes to England and says he wants to buy our goods, but says so in a way that is not standard English, no businessman is going to say, I'm not going to sell you the goods unless you speak proper English, dear boy. You know, that's 100 years ago. Now these new varieties have been taken seriously, and English as a lingua franca is focusing on this. What you must avoid is a premature judgment that everybody speaks English as a lingua franca in the same way. That is patently not the case. And some very premature claims were made at the outset that, you know, every one of you all around the English-speaking world is making the same kind of development in English, regardless of your individual mother tongue background. It seems to be, I don't know whether this is true or not. All the evidence I've seen so far suggests that there are as many variations around the English-speaking world as there are similarities in second language use. And so I think English as a lingua franca has got to evolve a great deal before we can talk about the way in which we can classify it, whether as a single variety or, more likely, I think, as a family of closely related varieties that differ from the traditional families of English that we've seen. Tim Harrell, how have US and UK English remained so close after 300 years? Well, I guess because of the nature of the interaction between the two. I mean, the phenomenon of accommodation is the critical thing here. People accommodate, this is the sociolinguistic notion, to each other when they like each other. Well, there was a time when the Brits and the Americans didn't like each other very much. They had a war on. But once that was over, then actually we became rather friendly. And friendliness does mean that people start sharing each other's usage. The direction of usage varies, as I was saying half an hour or so ago. But people have always noticed the differences and assumed that these were going to get logarithmically greater as time goes by. And the evidence seems to be that hasn't happened. And when you actually count up the total number of differences between British and American English, the answer is very, very small, actually. I remember when I was doing the index to the big quirk, comprehensive grammar of the English language, and I counted up in the index at the back the total number of grammatical differences between British and American English, and I got a couple of dozen only out of the 3,500 points of grammar being dealt with in that book. You know, things like I just ate versus I've just eaten, or it's 4:45 instead of 4:45, that sort of thing. Not very many differences at all. And in vocabulary, yes, a couple of thousand. But what's a couple of thousand when you're dealing with a language that has got over 1 million, you see? So one mustn't overestimate the differences. They can sometimes cause problems of intelligibility, still do. You notice these. There's a tendency then to think that the problems are the norm, whereas in fact they're really rather exceptional. And the same point applies to other varieties of English around the world. Here we go. There's a lot of people are asking questions about all sorts of things here. Oh, Tim again asked down the bottom, do you think that English will ever see a new function word? Don't know, unlikely. Function words tend to be the most stable things in English over the centuries. But you do see differences in the frequency of function words and differences in their functions. I suppose the best example of this is since the internet came along, and that lovely little sign that we use in our emails and things, at, that's a function word, all right. But at has shot up the frequency register over the last 20 years as a result of the internet, and has developed new uses that were not there before. And I think you will find on the internet equivalents to function words which have not yet received very much standardization. If you're on Twitter, for example, what are you going to do with all these hashtags and things? What are these hashtags? Well, they're function words, really, aren't they? Except they haven't received a kind of standard presence in the language yet. And somebody has just sent in a related question to what I've just said. How many words are there in the English language? We do not know. This is how you go for it. You add up all the words that are in the Oxford English Dictionary, the unabridged one, and that's getting on for 750,000. You add up all the words that are in the big American English Dictionary, the Webster International, and that's well over 500,000. Compare the two dictionaries and they're not the same. So you end up with well over 1 million for those two dictionaries alone. I talk about this quite a lot in my Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language, if you want to follow it up later. But then on top of that, there are all the abbreviations in the English-speaking world, which in the biggest book of abbreviations I know are about 750,000. And then there are all think of all the words for insects. Heaven knows, there are millions and millions of insects. They're all got to be talked about. They've all got words. A lot of them are Latin words, but still, if I use a Latin word in my English sentence, it becomes an English word, doesn't it? You can go on and on and on like this, let alone the vocabularies that are coming into English in the parts of the English-speaking world where you guys live at the moment. So I include in my total for English the 15,000 or so words that are in the Jamaican Dictionary of English and the 10,000 or more words in the South African Dictionary of English, or wherever you are, you've got an English-speaking dictionary either published or in train or in your heads, which involves thousands of words that are not part of British English or American English or anything else. And so these have got to be added in as well. And there are always new ones coming in. 2 or 3 words come into the English language every day, and these are not yet in the dictionaries. And if you don't believe me, go online to the Urban Dictionary if you dare. You've got to have a thick skin because it's pretty awful out there. But go in there and you'll see the thousands of new suggestions for words and new meanings of words that are being invented by people around the world every day. Now, most of them will never have a permanent place in the language, but temporarily they are there. So it's never possible to produce a total for English, but it is possible to show the speed at which the language is moving, and these are the sources that do that. Oh my, oh my, oh my. We're into the 30s now and going on, and it's getting on for 4 o'clock. I think the best thing to do, rather than to produce superficial and rather rapid and unsatisfactory responses to these things, as at the end of any seminar, and the bell rings and everybody has to go somewhere else, and you're probably all wanting a cup of tea or a drink or something, so am I, actually. Then I probably will leave these other questions now. They're all absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sending them in. What I'll do is I'll go through them. We have them in electronic form. So I'll shove them all up in a post on my website and I'll start putting in some answers, insofar as I can. I see some of them are asking me questions that I just don't know the answer to. Which I just say I don't know, because that's what linguists do an awful lot of the time. Remember a few years ago that American politician said the interesting questions are the unknown unknowns rather than the known unknowns. Well, there are lots of unknown unknowns in language and a lot of known unknowns in language. Some of these questions are about known unknowns. I'll be able to answer some of the known knowns. I'll do my best at those. But I think we're coming up to 4 o'clock, Marjorie, and others who are monitoring this. And perhaps we should cause a stop now. What do you think?
Can you now hear me?
I can hear you, Marjorie.
And
Beth has just sent in. Beth from Paris has just sent in a question. What is my favourite word? I haven't got one, Beth. But one thing you do need to know is that the word Beth in Welsh means what?
Interesting.
Please.
Okay, so I have to say thank you so much, David, for all this fantastic information. I think participants were very interested, as we can see from the chat box. Been overwhelming Hillary here with questions, and all I can say is we are delighted that you've kicked off this webinar series, and it's been absolutely fantastic for all of us. We are continuing with this series for those who are online. Claire, can you go on to the next slide? Here we go. We will be having the next webinar on Saturday, the 22nd of June, also at 3 o'clock, and we all learned this, British Summer Time, which we didn't realize was different from GMT, which is GMT plus 1, from what I understand. And this will be on using higher level thinking skills. We'll be posting more information about this soon, and all I can say is have a wonderful day, everyone. This has been a super experience, and David, thank you so much, and Hillary as well, for fielding the questions and getting them all organized. Hillary, you want to say hello?
Oh.
Hi, Hillary.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, and it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.